A thick, flat router tabletop like this one is essential for getting great cuts. Now, when you cover it with plastic laminate, you're sure to make sure that it's going to last a long time. The only thing that this router table needs is a way to attach a router to it. For that, I'm going to install an insert plate right in the middle. Now, there's a little bit more going on to it than just cutting an opening for the insert plate. There are a couple of key points to keep in mind as you're doing this. What you want is for that insert plate to be flush with the top of the router table. And you want the opening to be a nice snug fit to the insert so that it's not rattling around in there, because that can spoil the accuracy of your cut. So let's see how that works. Just pop the hood, so to speak. Here you can see that the insert rests on a lip that's cut around the edge of the router table. Then there's a large opening that goes all the way through the table to provide clearance for the router motor body and base. Now that works fine when you're using the router table in its standard configuration, but there's one other detail that I want to point out. In each of the corners, I've installed some threaded inserts. That way, I can set the insert in place and fix it with some machine screws. So now when I flip the router table up for horizontal routing, both the router and the insert plate are held secure. The process for installing the insert plate breaks down neatly into two steps. The first is to create the large opening for the router body. After that, you can create the recess that houses the insert plate itself. Now, I really want to get this right, so I don't want to spoil the router table top. So instead of trying to dial in the fit directly on the workpiece, I'm going to work with a pair of templates instead. So I'll create one template that has an opening sized for the opening that's going to go all the way through the router table top. The second template will have an opening that's sized for the plate, and then I can use a handheld router and a couple of bits to trim everything nice and flush. Of course, the real trick when you're working with templates is, how do you make the opening in the templates? I'm going to get everything cleared away here and we can walk through that process. I'm going to start by creating the template that's used for the opening that goes all the way through the router table top. And when you think about it, it's the easiest one to make because the opening just needs to be large enough to be able to easily get the router in and out of the router table. So there's nothing really critical about the size. In order to make the template, I've started by drilling an access hole here, and then I'm going to remove most of the waste, and then I can come back and clean up those edges up to my layout lines. To remove all that waste, I'm going to use just a jigsaw to cut it away. Fit the blade of the jigsaw into the access hole and begin cutting along one side. Stay just to the waist side of the layout line. As you reach the corner, rotate the template to cut the next side. Repeat the process to cut the remaining two sides of the template. After sanding the cut edges on the template's complete and you're ready to start putting it to use. That first use is to lay out the location of the opening on the router table top. You might remember that I had already drawn it in earlier. That was just to make things clear. It's really a good idea to use the actual opening on the template to mark those lines. You'll use those lines as a guide to drill starter holes in each of the corners of the opening. That way it'll give you a nice reference point and a starting point for the jigsaw blade as you cut the corners from point to point and help you navigate those curves. The thick top means that it'll take longer to cut through the waste material. So take your time and follow close to the layout lines. Don't try to force the jigsaw. Allow the blade to do the work to prevent it from deflecting in the cut. Well, that took quite a bit longer than I was expecting. Here's what happened. When I was cutting out the opening in the template, I wanted a nice smooth edge, so I used a fine-toothed blade. Now what I should have done before getting started cutting the much thicker top was to replace it with a coarser tooth blade to be able to make that cut a lot faster. Now that I've taken care of that detail, I can get started on finishing up this opening. Jigsaw did a fine job of removing the bulk of the waste to create the opening in the router tabletop to account for the router motor body and the insert plate. The next step is to clean up these cut edges so that they match the shape of the template that I made earlier. Now in order to do that, I've attached the template to the tabletop using a few strips of double-sided tape. The thing here though is that the router tabletop is so thick that I can't do it in one cut with a router bit. So instead I'm going to do it in 2 passes. For the first step, I'm going to use a handheld router and a pattern bit. Now this kind of bit has a bearing on the shank end of the bit. And that way the bearing will follow along the edge of the template as I clean up the cut opening. Set the router in place, keeping the bit away from the edge of the opening. Turn on the router and bring the bit so that the bearing contacts the edge of the template. Move the router clockwise around the opening in the template to trim the opening. As I said before, the pattern bit that I was using in the router isn't long enough to trim all of the waste. So the second step is to remove this remaining waste that I have here. And to do that, I need to flip the top upside down and switch to a different bit. The bit that I'm going to be using is a long flush trim bit like this one. Here you can see the bearing is on the bottom or the end of the bit. This way, the bearing will follow along the material that I've already cut, which acts as the template now, and then I can trim away the remaining waste. So all I need to do now is get this bit installed in the router, and then I can start trimming. Like before, start the router with the bit away from the edge. Bring the bit into the waste material and move the router clockwise around the opening. Trim away the waste, making a smooth, steady pass. The second part of creating an opening in the router tabletop is to create a shallow pocket that's going to house the router table insert plate. Now while the through hole didn't matter in terms of its size, when it comes to creating the pocket, I want it to match the size of the plate exactly. Now like before, I'm going to create that pocket using a hardboard template. Of course, the real trick here is making sure that the opening in the template matches the size of the insert plate. Here's how I did that. I set the insert plate over the blank for the template. Then I'm going to use a set of plywood guide strips that'll be used to shape that opening. Now the guide strips are held in place with a few strips of double-sided tape. I'm going to use one of the guide strips and the edge of the insert plate to set the first guide strip in place and press it down. Now it's just a matter of using the edge of the insert plate and the previous guide strip to install the other strips. Once they're all down, you can remove the insert plate and head over to the drill press. At the drill press, I installed a Forstner bit where the diameter matches the radius of the insert plate. Then I can use the guide strips to locate the Forstner bit and drill out the 4 corners for the opening on the template. After removing the waste using a jigsaw, I headed over to the router table where I installed a flush trim bit. Now, the bearing on that flush trim bit follows along the edge of the guide strips. The key thing here as you're routing each of the 4 edges is that you want to keep the bit away from the corners in order to preserve the radius that you created using the Forstner bit. You may find after routing the edges of the template opening that you'll need to do some fine sanding along the edges. What you're looking for is the insert plate to drop into the opening easily. I'm going to route the pocket using a handheld router. In the router, I've installed a Dado cleanout bit. Now, a Dado cleanout bit's nothing more than a pattern bit that has a bearing on its shank end and a real short cutting edge. The critical part here, though, is setting the final depth of cut for the bit. What you're looking for when you're creating the pocket is that the top of the insert plate is perfectly flush with the tabletop. To set the depth of cut, I'm going to use the insert plate and the template as a setup gauge. I'm going to set the router in place and lower the bit until the cutting edges just touch the tabletop, while I have the router itself sitting on both the insert plate and the template. Use a few strips of double-sided tape to secure the template to the router tabletop. The bearing on the router bit should follow along the edge of the template. Move the router clockwise around the opening in the template. In the corners, you'll have to make a few passes away from the template in order to remove the waste. Then set the bit for a deeper cut to make a second pass. Repeat the process until the depth of the pocket matches the thickness of the insert plate. When the pocket's complete, the insert plate fits nice and snug and is perfectly flush with the tabletop. There's just one step left to take care of, and that's to secure the insert plate so that it can't fall out. To do that, I'll just lift it out here. I drilled holes in each of the corners of the pocket. Those holes are going to accept machine screws that'll allow the insert plate to stay in place. The machine screws themselves thread into a threaded insert that I installed on the bottom face of the tabletop. With the insert plate completed, there's one other hardware item that I want to wrap up, and that's to install the combination track in the groove cut at the front edge of the tabletop. That combination track, if you remember, has a wide slot that you can use miter gauge with, as well as a T-track that comes in handy for attaching feather boards and other accessories. The work on our router table project is coming along pretty well. I just wrapped up the work on the router table top, and as you'll remember, Don completed the base some time ago. So it's time now to join the top to the base, but there's a little bit more to it than just making a simple connection. This router table not only needs to function as a traditional router table like this, but the top is designed to pivot upright for horizontal routing operations. That task falls to a pair of plywood quadrants that join the table top to the base. It does that with a pivot pin and a curved slot so that I can lock the table in either of the positions. There are a few operations involved in making the quadrants, and it starts by cutting a plywood blank to the rough overall size. From there, it's on to a little bit of layout work. I'm going to lay out the pivot point, and then I can use that to lay out the outer curved shape of the quadrant, as well as the adjustment slot just inside that. Now that adjustment slot is the key part of it, so I'm going to save that for later on. For now though, I'm going to head over to the drill press. And I can use a drill bit to drill out the pivot point and then install a Forstner bit and drill out the inside radius up at the edge of the quadrant. Once that's taken care of, it's over to the bandsaw where I can cut right on this layout line for the tab on the quadrant. Then for the outer curved shape, I want to stay just to the waist side of the line as I cut the outside shape to remove the bulk of the waist. At this point, I'm ready to cut the adjustment slot in the quadrant. Now there's a couple of key features here. I want the curve on the slot to be smooth and even, and I also need it to be a consistent distance to the pivot hole. In order to do that, I'm going to use a plunge router and a simple shop-made trammel. Now the trammel's nothing more than a piece of hardboard that I've attached the router to with some screws. At one end, I drilled a hole and used a short length of dowel to act as a pivot pin. The center point from the pivot pin to the inside cutting edge of the router bit matches the distance from the center of the pivot hole to the inside edge of the slot. As for the router bit itself, I'm using a straight bit where the diameter of the bit matches the width of the slot. In this case, a 5/8 inch bit. Now, since this is a through cut, I don't want to route into my bench top. So I've set the quadrant on a backer piece of MDF. I'm going to attach the quadrant using a few pieces of double-sided tape. Can press it in place and then set the trammel so the pivot pin goes right into the hole in order to make the cut. For a cut of this size, it's a good idea to make it in several shallow passes. Turn on the router, plunge the bit into the workpiece, and rotate the trammel until you get to the end of the slot. Raise the router and turn it off. Adjust the depth stop, turn the router back on, and make a second pass. Repeat the process until you cut through the quadrant. Well, the trammel jig did a fine job in creating a smooth, consistent arc for the adjustment slot. Now, before I remove this quadrant and start work on the other one, I want to take care of one other step, and that's to clean up the outside edge of the quadrant. Now, I rough cut it earlier, and it really doesn't matter on the final shape, but since I have the trammel jig here, I can use that to clean up the edge in no time. In order to do that, I drilled another hole near the end of the trammel jig, so I can just pull the pin out, slide it into that other hole. Now the distance between the center point of the pin and the router bit matches the radius from the pivot hole to the outside edge of the quadrant. And now I can just clean that up and it won't take any time. Since I'm only making a skim cut, I can plunge the router to full depth and cut the outside edge in a single pass. After taking some time to cut the slot and clean up the edges on the second quadrant, I eased all of the outside edges with a gentle round over. That means it's time to attach the quadrants to the tabletop. Now you can see here that the quadrants fit into a dado that's cut in the bottom face of the tabletop. What's important about creating those dados is that the dado lines up with the openings in the base of the router table. The numbers in the plans will give you a good idea for locating those dados. However, you're going to want to double check that by measuring the distance between the openings in the base on your router table. Now in a perfect world, you'd want the outside edge of the quadrant to align with the inside edge of the case side. But I don't want that to bind, which could interfere with the movement of the top. So instead, I've left a small 1/16 inch of a gap there. You'll also see that the dado stops a couple of inches short of the back edge of the router tabletop. In the horizontal position, that gives me plenty of clear space at the front of the table and just a little bit of overhang at the back. Armed with that information, you can use those numbers to lay out the stop dados on the underside of the router tabletop. I started by laying out the outside edge of the dado. Then I can bring in one of the quadrants, set it in place aligned with that line, and then trace it on the other side to mark the other side of the dado. Cutting stop dados like these is the perfect opportunity to use a handheld plunge router. An edge guide attached to the plunge router will follow along the end of the router tabletop in order to guide the cut and keep it nice and straight. Now, I've often found that the plywood that I use often measures a little bit less than its stated thickness. So I've installed a straight bit here that's a special plywood bit that matches the size of the plywood. Adjust the edge guide so that when the edge guide is positioned against the end of the router table top, the bit is aligned with the layout lines. Turn on the router and plunge the bit into the workpiece. Then, holding the edge guide against the tabletop, slide the router forward until you reach the end of the cut. Retract the bit and turn off the router. Adjust the depth stop for a slightly deeper cut and make a second pass. Route the dado in several shallow passes. Repeat the process until the dado reaches final depth. The quadrants are glued into the stop dados. Now when I fit mine in place, it fits in there nice and snug, so I know that it's going to be a really strong glue joint. If your quadrant is a little loose in the dado, you can reinforce it with some pocket screws installed from the inside. There are a couple of key details here when you're gluing the quadrants in. First is to make sure that the quadrants are square to the tabletop. And then you also want to make sure that each one is located a consistent distance from the back edge of the table as you glue it up. Once I have this one installed, this tabletop is ready to be added to the base. Once the glue's dry and the clamps come off, the top is ready to be installed on the base. And that just requires a little bit of hardware. Up at the front, we need a pivot point. So all you need to do here is cut a section of steel rod, slip it into the hole, then just tap it in. At the back, we need a way to be able to clamp this table and keep it locked in position, whether it's in the vertical position or the horizontal. To do that, I'm going to use some other hardware, a large carriage bolt, a washer, and a large knob. The carriage bolt fits through a hole in the back, and the head seats up against the quadrant. And I can slip the washer in place and thread on the knob. When that's taken care of, now no matter whether the table is upright or horizontal like this, I can lock it down nice and secure. And this way, you have a large flat work surface that's perfect for using with bearing guided bits. However, with a couple of additions, you can get even more use out of the router table. The first addition adds both safety and convenience, and it's an auxiliary power switch. What's handy about this is that you no longer have to reach way under the router table to get to the motor to turn off the router. Everything is right here. So instead of plugging the router into the wall, you'll plug the router into the cord on the switch. Then you plug the switch into the wall. Now whether you're starting or stopping the router, it's all close at hand. The big challenge is figuring out what side of the base you're going to attach it to. Now we chose to attach ours on the left side because with the router in its standard setup, this is on the outfeed side and it's where you're going to end up anyway. The other addition is a fence. Now the fence attaches to the 3 holes that we drilled in the top earlier, and it'll be mounted in place with a large knob and a washer. What I really like about the fence though is the features that it incorporates. First of these is a T-track that's installed in the face. That makes it easy to install stop blocks or feather boards. The other detail that I like is the dust port on the back. That way you can collect dust and chips right at the source. One of the things I really like about the fence is just how easy it is to build. It really consists of 4 pieces. There's a fence face made from hardwood, and a wide base, as well as 2 small support blocks. But there are a couple of fence details that I want to point out as well. You'll need to cut a groove on the fence face that's going to hold the T-track. There's also a centered notch that provides clearance for a router bit. On the back side of the fence, there's a larger notch that makes it easier for the shop vacuum to draw away the dust and chips that are created through the dust port. At the table saw, I installed a Dado blade that was set to match the width of the T-track. Set the blade height to match the thickness of the T-track, and cut a groove in the fence face. With the same Dado blade installed, raise the height of the blade to cut the notch in the fence face. Guide the workpiece using a miter gauge. Make a second cut to complete the notch. Using the same Dado blade and miter gauge setup, cut a wider notch in the fence base. You'll need to make several passes to complete the notch. A slot cut near each end of the fence base is used to attach the fence to the router table top. There are several ways you can cut a slot, but one that I like to do starts with the drill press, where I'll take a drill bit and drill out each end of the slot and then remove most of the remaining waste with a jigsaw. Set the drill press fence to ensure that the ends of the slot are a consistent distance from the end of the base. After drilling the 2 holes, turn the base around and drill out the end of the other slot. The second step in creating the adjustment slot on the router table fence is to remove the waste between the 2 end holes. I did that with a jigsaw. I made a cut on the waste side of each of the layout lines. Once that's done, I can come back with a file and then with some sandpaper that I applied to a piece of hardboard and just clean up those edges so they're nice and straight. Once that's done, it's just a matter of taking care of a few final details. I rounded over the back corner of the fence as well as the top of the fence face. While I was at it, I also drilled some pilot holes that are used to attach the face to the base, as well as a couple of pilot holes to attach the support blocks on the back. When that's all taken care of, I'm ready to start assembly. Just slide things back here, and I'm going to run a thin bead of glue on the bottom edge of the fence. And slide everything together here. And before driving the screws, I'm going to clamp everything up so it doesn't shift around. Make sure everything's flush. There we go. After assembling all the hardwood pieces for the fence, it's just a matter of adding two hardware items. That's a T-track along the front for stops and featherboards, and then a dust port on the back. With that, I can install the fence on the router table. I'm going to do that with a long studded knob and a washer that thread into the T-nuts on the bottom face of the table. That means that the router table is now set up for all your traditional router operations. All that's left is to make an auxiliary table for use for horizontal routing.